Chapter 1. The Descent of Iron. Act 1. The Kinetic Drop. The void did not yield gracefully. It tore away in sheets of friction-white fire. Inside Drop Pod Aegis 7, there was no sound but the screaming symphony of atmospheric displacement. The hull, 6 inches of dense, faith-welded plasteel, groaned as it punched through the toxic, sulfur-choked cloud decks of Hivekeep 9. Inside the interior cradle, Commander Valen hung suspended by heavy magnetic harness clamps. His primary eye was closed, his mind entirely decoupled from his biological senses. Instead, his consciousness was hardwired into the pod's tactical telemetry array. Through the data feed, the world below was a landscape of digital rot. Tactical telemetry. Drop Pod Aegis 7. Current velocity Mach 6.4. Decelerating. Altitude 14,000 meters. Target. Coords. Sector 04. District of the Foundry. Atmospheric toxicity 88% sulfuric/acidic. Valen, a voice rasped across the localized neural net. It was Thrain, his voice a heavy sub-bass rumble that vibrated through the pod's internal frame. The automated orbital batteries on the high spires, they aren't firing at us. They aren't firing at anything. The grid is completely dark. The Directorate does not leave their guns cold unless there is no one left to pull the triggers, brother. Valen rumbled back, his mechanical vocal synthesizer lending a flat, terrifying weight to his words. Brace for deceleration. The lower air layers are thick. A violent, bone-shattering shudder tore through the pod. The retro-thrusters ignited with a muffled thoom, pushing 900 pounds of armored Knight into the restraining webbing. To Valen's left, Knight Scribe Cassian was reciting the liturgy of the steady hand in a rapid, breathless whisper that bled through his open Vox channel. He was young, his fanaticism still unblunted by the long centuries of the outer frontier. His fingers, encased in the heavy brass-trimmed gauntlets of the Order, were clamped tight around the grip of his Mauler carbine. "The Saint watches the descent," Cassian muttered, his eyes bloodshot behind his amber visor. "The Saint counts the steps into the pit." "Save your breath for the mud, Scribe," Thrain grunted. The proximity klaxon began to wail, a sharp, piercing beep, beep, beep that overrode the neural telemetry. Impact in 3, 2, 1. The universe ended in a catastrophic slam. The base of the drop pod hit the cracked basalt of Hivekeep 9's industrial plaza at 300 miles per hour. The internal inertia dampeners screamed, absorbing 90% of the kinetic shock, but the remaining 10% hit the squad like a physical hammer. The magnetic harness clamps blew open with a synchronized explosive clack, dropping the 3 Knights onto the metal mesh floor plates of the pod. For a second, the only sound was the ticking of the cooling hull and the heavy mechanical exhalations of their armor's life support systems. Audio cue. A sudden, violent, explosive pop as the pod's 5 hydraulic doors blow outward, falling flat into the toxic dirt like the petals of an iron flower. Act 2. The ash-choked plaza. Commander Valen was the first to step into the light. The air of Hivekeep 9 was a bruised, violet fog, thick with the oily soot of 1,000 cooling furnaces. The sky above was a ceiling of low, churning yellow clouds that wept a thin, acidic rain. It hissed as it struck the hot brass shoulders of Valen's Aegis carapace. He raised his sunder hammer. The weapon was ancient, its heavy head etched with the devotional runes of the sovereignty's core worlds. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he activated the internal gravity core. The hammer let out a low, vibrant hum that cleared the falling ash from the air around him in a perfect 3-foot circle. "Cassian, establish the perimeter," Valen ordered, his visor zooming in on the massive Gothic silhouette of the central cathedral foundry half a mile away. "Thrain, check the pod's ammunition reserve." The plaza was an industrial wasteland. Massive cargo containers lay overturned, their contents scattered into the mud. But there were no bodies, no signs of a conventional war, no artillery craters or shell casings. There was only a profound, unnatural silence that felt heavy against the skin. "Commander," Cassian called out, his Mauler carbine brought up to his shoulder as he swept the perimeter. "Look at the cobbles. This isn't mud." Valen walked over, his heavy boots crunching on the stone. He looked down through his optical visor, switching the display to an organic chemical scan. The stones of the plaza were covered in a thick, translucent film of calcified matter. It looked like a layer of dried, yellowed bone that had been melted down and painted over the ground. Tiny, thread-like structures, veins of dark purple tissue, pulsed weakly within the calcified crust, anchoring themselves into the seams of the masonry. Chemical analysis, surface crust. Compound, calcium/amino acid. Complex, profile, organic vector, the bleed. Status, active/feeding. "The world is being digested," Valen murmured, his deep voice dropping into a flat, solemn register. "The bleed didn't just breach the walls, it's rewriting the architecture." Suddenly, Thrain stepped out from the wreckage of the pod, his massive tower Aegis shield held high. "We have a problem, Commander. The pod's long-range Vox relay is fried. The atmospheric density is too high for orbital penetration. We are completely cut off from the fleet until we find a high-altitude transmission tower." "Then we move to the cathedral foundry," Valen said, pointing his hammer toward the massive Gothic structure ahead. The Directorate's regional governor had his command center inside the high spires. If anyone is left alive, they will be there. Before they could take a step, the calcified crust beneath their feet began to vibrate. Act 3. The first harvest. Audio cue. A low, wet, tearing sound from the shadows of the surrounding cargo containers. It sounds like meat being ripped away from a bone, rapidly accelerating into a frantic, clicking chorus. "Movement!" Cassian yelled, dropping to one knee as his targeting computer flashed a dozen red icons onto his visor. Multiple contacts emerging from the logistics trenches, 50 meters and closing fast. Out from the darkness of the overturned cargo containers came the vanguard of the swarm. They were not animals. They were biological machines. The creatures were the size of hounds, their bodies entirely encased in a segmented, bone-white chitin that glistened with acidic slime. They had no eyes, only a long vertical slit down the center of their heads, that hissed with a pale yellow gas. Their limbs were clusters of needle-sharp, calcified spikes that clicked rhythmically against the stone. "Hold the line," Valen roared. "Thrain, shield wall." Thrain stepped forward, planting the base of his massive tower Aegis shield into the calcified crust. The shield's internal power field ignited with a sharp, blue crackle, creating a solid wall of kinetic force 6 feet wide. The first wave of monsters hit the shield like a tidal wave of bone and muscle. They threw themselves against the blue energy field with mindless, suicidal fury, their chitinous limbs shattering against the force field only for more to leap over the bodies of the fallen. Thump, 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 thump. Cassian's Mauler carbine opened fire. The weapon was deafening, its high-velocity explosive slugs tearing through the bone-white shells of the monsters at point-blank range. Every hit sent a spray of thick, purple biofluid across the plaza, the acidic blood smoking as it hit the stone. "They have no fear," Cassian shouted over the roar of his rifle, his voice rising with that familiar manic intensity. "They are blind to the steel. They are blind to the light." "Because they aren't individuals, Scribe," Valen bellowed. The commander stepped out from
Chapter
behind
2,
Thrain's shield.
The Cathedral of
He
Brass.
swung his sunder
Act
hammer
1,
in a massive,
The Threshold of
two-handed
Sanctuary.
horizontal
The great
arc.
iron doors of the
The
Foundry
gravity
Cathedral
core discharged
loomed out of
upon
the
impact,
violet smog like the
creating a
jaw of a
localized
dormant
pressure
leviathan.
wave that didn't just
30 feet
smash
of riveted
the three
black
leading
iron,
monsters.
reinforced
It
with heavy
imploded
brass
their
plating
internal
and
structures,
embossed with the
turning
stark,
their bone
angular
plates into
cogs of the
high-velocity
Directorate's industrial
shrapnel that
priesthood.
shredded the creatures
Thrain,
behind them.
brace the portal, but
For
Valen
every
roared,
10 they
his
killed,
armor's rear vents
20
coughing
more
thick,
emerged from
oily
the dark
exhaust
trenches.
as he backed toward the
Valen's
steps.
visor tracked
Behind
a
them, the
massive
plaza
shadow
was a churning
rising
sea of
from the
white
central
chitin
logistics
and clicking
shaft
limbs.
at the edge of
The
the
swarm
plaza.
had ceased
A
its
towering,
erratic skittering.
multi-limbed
It was
brute
moving now
with
as a
claws the
singular
size of
fluid
scythes,
wave of
its
biological
massive
mass,
thoracic
driven by the
plates
massive,
pulsing with a
multi-limbed
wet,
brute
purple
rising
light.
from the logistics
Valen
shaft.
raised his hammer,
The towering
his
monster
remaining
let out a
organic eye
high-frequency
narrowing
shriek
in the dark
that didn't
of his
travel
helmet.
through the air, but
"Retreat
rattled
to the
squad's
cathedral
internal
gates,"
audio
Valen
buffers
ordered,
like a
his
localized
voice
static
echoing through the
discharge.
vaults.
Thrain
"We cannot
slammed his
hold the
back
open
against
plaza.
the iron door,
To the
his
iron
hydraulic
doors,
servo
brothers.
screaming as he used
Move."
his massive frame to brace the seam. He raised his heavy kinetic rifle with his left hand, laying down a rhythmic, suppressive wall of fire that kept the leading edge of the swarm from scaling the marble stairs. Thum, thum, thum. "Cassian, the cutter," Valen commanded, his sunder hammer tracing a brilliant violet arc through the dark air as he smashed a leaping biodrone into a pulp of bone and purple fluid. Cassian dropped to his knees at the base of the doors. He didn't use a key. He ripped the control housing off the wall with his bare gauntlet, exposing a nest of copper wires and fiber optic tethers. He jammed his industrial plasma cutter into the secondary mechanical override loop. "The security protocols are active, Commander," Cassian yelled, his faceplates lit by the blinding blue glare of the plasma arc. "The Directorate didn't lock this out to keep the monsters out. They locked it from the inside. They sealed the workers in." "Cut it clear, Scribe," Thrain grunted, a calcified spine from a drone shearing across his shoulder plate, exposing the raw brass beneath. "We're running out of steps." With a violent screech of protesting gears, the mechanical locking bolts retracted inside the iron doors. The left portal swung inward by a few feet, revealing a yawning, pitch-black chasm that smelled heavily of stagnant grease, ozone, and copper. "Inside! Move!" Valen ordered. He grabbed Cassian by his rear lift handle, hoisting the young scribe through the gap before stepping in behind Thrain. Together, the two heavy knights threw their weight against the closing iron door, slamming it shut, just as the mass of the swarm hit the exterior face, with a sound like 1,000 breaking stones. Valen threw the heavy mechanical locking bars into place. The violent thumping from the outside continued, shaking the dust from the high Gothic arches above, but the iron held. Act 2. The Silent Assembly. The interior of the cathedral foundry was a vast, cathedral-like assembly hall that stretched miles into the dark. There were no candles here, no stained glass windows celebrating the saints. Instead, towering rows of industrial casting furnaces rose like black obsidian idols toward a ceiling obscured by layers of hanging soot. The silence inside was total, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos of the plaza outside. Bring up the long-range optics, Valen muttered, his helmet's internal display shifting to an infrared sweep. Infrared sweep. Assembly Sector 01. Thermal signatures 0.0%. Motion detected. Absent. Industrial cores. Dormant/cooling. It's cold, Cassian whispered, his Mauler carbine raised as he swept the long shadows between the assembly lines. A facility of this scale takes weeks to cool down to this temperature. If the bleed took them, where is the biomass? Where are the signs of a struggle? They walked down the central aisle, their heavy plasteel boots echoing loudly off the polished brass floor plates. The assembly lines were lined with thousands of empty workstations, their tools laid out in meticulous, bureaucratic order. It looked as if the 4 million citizens of Hivekeep 9 had simply laid down their wrenches and vanished into thin air. "Look at the vats," Thrain said, stopping beside a massive triple-insulated industrial vat that extended through the floor into the lower levels. Valen stepped up to the rim, his visor zooming in on the dark residue coating the interior walls. It wasn't the purple, vein-like slurry of the bleed. It was gray, metallic, and smelled of chemical formatting fluids and liquefied iron. "This isn't casting steel," Valen said, dipping his gauntlet into the residue. The liquid clung to his finger plates like a heavy magnetic oil, reacting to the small electrical currents in his armor. "It's amniotic formatting fluid. The Directorate was using this facility to manufacture advanced cybernetic matrices. At a civilian level." "That's a high-tier heresy," Cassian said, his voice tightening with a mixture of fear and fanatical outrage. "The manufacturing of automated flesh shells without a direct mandate from the High Sanctum is punishable by planetary eradication." Vance didn't care about mandates, a weak, fractured voice whispered from the darkness above them. Act 3. The Logic of the Heretic. Valen's visor snapped upward, his targeting computer instantly locking onto a dangling platform suspended 20 feet above the central vat. Floating in the center of the platform was a horrific piece of machinery, a mobile life support cradle made of tarnished brass and dozens of twitching, copper-wired needles. Suspended within the cradle was a human torso, its legs gone, replaced by a maze of hydraulic tubes that ran directly into the assembly line's primary data conduit. The face was human, but barely. The skin was translucent, stretched tight over a skull that had been heavily modified with external cognitive processors. One eye was gone, replaced by a rotating green optical lens that clicked rhythmically as it focused on the knights below. "Director General Vance," Valen rumbled, his sunder hammer glowing a low, threatening violet as he stepped beneath the platform. "Commander Valen," the half-man wheezed, his organic mouth twisting into a wet, pathetic smile. "The Sovereignty sent its finest hounds, but you are too late. The casting is already complete." "Where are the citizens, Vance?" Cassian demanded, his rifle aimed directly at the director's exposed skull. "Where are the 4 million souls of this sector?" Vance let out a wet, rattling chuckle that turned into a coughing fit, a thin stream of gray oil running from his lips. "They are right here, Scribe. They are all around you. The bleed was coming through the outer walls. The flesh is weak. It rots, it screams, it yields to the vector. So I offered them a better solution. I optimized them." Vance's remaining hand, a skeletal claw of titanium and wire, slammed down onto a manual override console. Audio cue. A sudden, deafening mechanical clank as the floor beneath the 3 knights begins to split open, the massive brass plates retracting to reveal the true, terrifying scale of the cathedral's lower levels. Valen looked down. Below them, stretching for miles into the subterranean dark, were millions of vertical stasis alcoves. Inside each alcove stood a soldier. They had no eyes, no hair, no skin. Their bodies were entirely encased in a seamless, gunmetal gray chassis of cast iron and plasteel, their chests glowing with a cold, unblinking green light. 4 million soldiers, Vance whispered, his green optical lens spinning out of control with a manic, ecstatic joy. Made from the very people they were meant to protect, a skin made of iron that the bleed cannot digest. They have no names, no fear, no souls to be corrupted. They are the iron-skinned, and they are waiting for my word. Chapter 3. The Weaver's Cradle. Act 1. The Awakening of Grey. The subterranean vault did not just open, it breathed. A heavy collective exhalation of frozen nitrogen and synthetic grease rolled up from the miles of vertical stasis alcoves, instantly coating the brass floor of the high spire in a thin layer of white rime. Warning: localized cognitive signals detected. Source: sublevels 0, 1 through 40. Quantity: 4.2 million logical nodes. Valen did not look at the data flashing across his visor. His primary eye remained locked on the swinging brass cradle where the half-man, Director General Vance, hung suspended. "They have no voices to scream with, Commander," Vance wheezed, his titanium fingers typing a frantic, rhythmic sequence into his data conduit. "But they think. Oh, how they think. 4 million minds synchronized into a singular, beautiful engine of survival. They are the only shield humanity has left against the cosmic rot." "You did not build a shield, Vance," Valen rumbled, his mechanical vocal synthesizer vibrating the iron grating beneath his boots. "You built an abomination. You ground away the saint's image from the flesh of the faithful." "The saint's image does not stop a hyper-evolved biovector from melting your marrow, boy," Vance shrieked, his cracked voice echoing off the high Gothic arches. Before Cassian could pull his trigger, the vertical stasis alcoves beneath them flamed to life, not with fire, but with a synchronized blinding flash of emerald light. Millions of unblinking green optical sensors ignited simultaneously in the dark abyss, looking upward toward the observation platform. Audio cue. A low, rhythmic, multi-ton mechanical clank, the sound of 4 million metal-shod feet stepping out of their containment frames in perfect, terrifying unison. "They are waking," Thrain said, his heavy voice remarkably flat as he leveled his kinetic rifle toward the subterranean steps. "Commander, the security perimeter is gone. If those things come up the central shafts, they'll grind us into filings through sheer volume." "Cassian, find the access to the high spires," Valen commanded, his sunder hammer crackling with an angry violet gravity field. "We do not fight the Legion here. We find the girl. She is the anchor for this facility's navigation grid. If we control her, we control the extraction." "By the blood of the throne," Cassian muttered, his hands shaking slightly as he jammed his plasma cutter into the elevator shaft's primary control block. "The elevator is dead, Commander. Vance has routed all local auxiliary power directly into the casting foundries below." "Then we climb the ribs," Valen said, pointing his hammer toward the massive decorative titanium pillars that rose like the skeletal structure of a great beast toward the high ceiling. Act 2. The Vertical Ascent. The climb was an exercise in industrial survival. The 3 knights, weighing nearly a ton each in their fully loaded Aegis carapaces, scaled the decorative rivets of the titanium pillars. Below them, the first wave of the iron-skinned was already surging up the grand marble staircases of the cathedral. They did not move like the chaotic, clicking swarm outside. They moved like a liquid wall of gunmetal gray. Their eyeless, smooth-plated faces were fixed upward, their iron limbs moving with a silent mathematical precision that was entirely devoid of human hesitation. They carried no rifles. Their forearms had been cold-forged into long, heavy blades of industrial tungsten. "They're scaling the secondary struts," Thrain bellowed from the pillar to Valen's right. He unhitched his tower aegis shield, using its heavy magnetic rim to slice through a cluster of 3 iron-skinned soldiers who had managed to leap onto his leg plates. The cyborgs fell silently, their emerald eye slots remaining lit even as their chassis shattered against the brass deck 50 feet below. They made no sound as they died, no groans, no cries, just the cold, dead clinking of metal on metal. "Cassian, use the microcharges," Valen ordered, his mechanical arms straining as he hauled himself onto the high logistics catwalk that circled the base of the Weaver's tower. Cassian reached into his tactical harness, pulling a trio of high-velocity thermal discs. He punched them directly into the joint of the main titanium pillar beneath them. "Forgive the vandalism, Saint," Cassian whispered, before slamming his hand onto the detonator. Audio cue. A sharp, cracking explosion that transitions instantly into a screaming metallic tear as the massive pillar buckles, collapsing outward into the lower assembly lines, taking thousands of the ascending iron-skinned with it. The blast cleared the line, giving the squad 3 seconds to breach the high observation airlock. Valen slammed his sunder hammer into the vault's control seal, the gravity strike instantly turning the brass lock into dust. They spilled through the threshold into the high spires, slamming the thick lead-shielded door behind them. Act 3. The Silver Room. The high spire was a different world. The roar of the furnaces and the clinking of the Legion vanished, replaced by a profound, clinical silence that smelled intensely of liquid mercury and ozone. The walls were made of polished white porcelain, curved inward to form a perfect, circular amphitheater. Suspended in the center of the room by thousands of fine, silver-wired cables was a massive glass orb filled with a churning reflective fluid, the lethoserum. Inside the fluid hung a girl. She could not have been older than 16. Her hair floated around her face like a cloud of dark ink, her skin so pale it was almost translucent, stained a ghostly silver around the temples where the neural microfilaments entered her skull. Her eyes were open, staring blankly through the glass, her pupils completely dilated into twin pools of reflective quicksilver. Neural survey, reconstruction target. Subject, Acolyte Lyra, Psychic Class Phi. Matrix, Sync, 94%, critical level. Core status, Navigation grid, anchored. "She isn't dead," Cassian whispered, his fanatical intensity dropping into a hollow, horrified awe as he stepped toward the base of the orb. She's singing. "Commander, listen to the Vox channels." Valen tuned his internal audio grid to the station's frequencies. Through the static, a voice drifted into his mind. It wasn't a scream. It was a low, layered, beautiful melody, a child's lullaby, sung in a language that had been dead for 10 centuries, but pulsing with enough psychic energy to vibrate the plasteel plates of his helmet. "She is the compass," Valen said, his heavy voice softening for the first time. "Vance didn't just modify the citizens. He used her mind to bind the Legion's hive logic together. Without her, the 4 million below are just blind iron." Suddenly, the white porcelain floor beneath them shuddered. The grand observation windows that looked out over the exterior plaza cracked. Through the glass, Valen saw the sky turning an oily, violent purple. The vanguard of the swarm outside had finished devouring the outer defenses. The massive multi-limbed bio-brute was standing at the base of the spire, its scythe claws tearing through the building's external support pillars. The bleed was no longer waiting outside. It had smelled the concentration of psychic energy in the high room. Valen raised his hammer, his single organic eye fixed on the silver girl in the glass. "Cassian, prepare the extraction cradle. Thrain, line the door. The swarm is coming up the walls, and the Iron Legion is right behind them." Chapter 4. The Logic of the Furnace Act. 1. The Shattered Window. The high porcelain walls of the spire did not fracture cleanly. They spiderwebbed like ancient ice before exploding inward. A wave of freezing, sulfur-heavy rain lashed through the newly torn breach, instantly condensing the pristine ozone of the silver room into a choking white fog. Through the smoke came the first limb, a 30-foot serrated bone scythe that gouged a 6-inch trench across the polished floor, sending porcelain shrapnel flying through the air like daggers. "Brace!" Valen roared, his sunder hammer flaring to life with a blinding, violet gravity field as he planted his boots between the breach and the glass orb holding Lyra. The multi-limbed bio-brute from the plaza had scaled the spine of the cathedral, its massive, chitin-plated head thrust through the shattered opening, its eyeless face splitting open horizontally to reveal rows of wet, needle-sharp mandibles that dripped a yellow, flesh-dissolving acid. Hiss crack. A concentrated stream of the bioacid spat from the beast's gullet, striking Thrain's tower aegis shield as he lunged forward to cover the retreat. The blue kinetic energy field screamed, flickering violently as the organic acid began to eat directly through the power grid cells of the plasteel frame. "The field is failing," Thrain bellowed, his hydraulic knee servos popping under the sheer physical weight of the beast pressing against his shield. "Commander, I can't hold the kinetic seal for more than 10 seconds. To their rear, the heavy lead-shielded door leading back to the assembly foundries began to buckle inward. The silent, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the iron-skinned legion echoed through the metal. Vance's automated children were using their tungsten-bladed forearms to systematically carve through the 3-inch steel locks. The squad was completely out of room. They were caught in the narrow vice between cosmic corruption and cold, unfeeling steel. Act 2. The desperation of the scribe. "Cassian, the cables," Valen ordered, his voice dropping into that terrifying, flat, battlefield frequency that demanded absolute obedience. Night Scribe Cassian was already at the base of the glass orb. His Mauler carbine hung from its tactical sling as he used his heavy brass-trimmed gauntlets to rip away the porcelain housing of the primary neural tether. The thousands of silver-wired microfilaments, pulsing with Lyra's lullaby, were hot to the touch, humming with enough raw psychic energy to throw blue static sparks across his optical visors. "Warning. Direct psychic feedback. Detected neural load. Dangerous. If I cut the primary line cleanly, the feedback will stop her heart," Cassian shouted, his hands hovering over the main emergency shunt valve. "We need a localized power ground, something to absorb the electronic death cry of the Matrix." "Use my chassis," Valen rumbled, stepping backward until his heavy aegis carapace pressed firmly against the glass base of the orb. Chapter 5. Operation Gambit. Act 1. The Logistics Vault. The descent into the lower hangar bays was a plunge into an industrial underworld. Without the psychic broadcast from the Weaver Matrix, the cathedral's automated systems had fallen into a state of vegetative confusion. Emergency low-lux amber lamps flickered along the iron-ribbed catwalks, casting long geometric shadows across the silent assembly lines. Below them, millions of the dormant, iron-skinned, stood motionless in their stasis racks like a forest of gray pillars, their emerald eyes dimmed to a faint, hollow spark. Cassian led the sprint down the emergency maintenance stairs, his heavy brass-trimmed armor throwing off a continuous spray of fine, white static sparks from the residual feedback. In his arms, Lyra was a dead weight, her breathing shallow, her silver-stained skin turning a mottled, cold gray. "The hangar doors are ahead," Cassian rasped over the short-range squad vox, his voice thick with exhaustion. "But the grid is dead. The primary blast doors are down on their mechanical locks. We have no power to cycle the mag tracks." Behind them, the silent corridor suddenly erupted with a wet, frantic clicking. The bleed hadn't stopped. Stripped of the massive psychic signal from the high spire, The swarm had fractured into smaller, starving hunting packs, scattering through the ventilation shafts to track the raw human biomass of the remaining survivors. Audio cue. A sudden metal-tearing crash from the ceiling above as three bone-plated bio-drones drop onto the catwalk, their scythe limbs striking the iron mesh with a ringing hiss. "Keep moving," Thrain roared. He didn't waste ammunition. He spun his massive frame around, using the physical weight of his tower Aegis shield like a horizontal pendulum to crush the leading drone against the structural wall. The creature's purple blood sprayed across his visor, smoking violently as it ate into his optical tracking lenses. Act 2. The Iron Gate Standoff. The squad spilled onto the deck of Hangar Bay 0. The space was massive, a subterranean cavern of riveted steel designed to hold the Directorate's heavy long-range logistics shuttles. At the center of the bay sat their extraction target, a blocky delta-winged assault transport bearing the slate-gray livery of the regional governor. Its heavy landing gears were locked into the deck plates, its loading ramp down, its sublight thrusters humming in a state of cold standby. But they were not alone. Standing at the base of the transport's boarding ramp was Director General Vance. His floating life support cradle was now hooked directly into the external power conduits of the shuttle itself. Dozens of thick, black data tethers ran from his cybernetic torso into the ship's primary logic core. Flanking him were 6 fully active, reinforced, iron-skinned Praetorians, their chassis thicker than the standard Legionnaires, their tungsten forearm blades vibrating at a high frequency that filled the room with a sickening subsonic hum. "You cannot leave the garden, Commander," Vance's voice bellowed through the hangar's emergency vox horns, distorted and layered with the ship's internal sirens. His remaining green optical lens whined as it spun to focus on the approaching knights. "The shuttle's navigation core is slave-linked to my neural cortex. If you kill me, the ship stays in the dirt. If you stay in the dirt, the swarm consumes us all." Valen stepped forward. His armor was blackened, gray smoke still weeping from his blown chest capacitors, his mechanical voice synthesizer entirely dead. He couldn't speak, but the deliberate, heavy placement of his gunmetal boots on the steel deck was an answer in itself. He raised his sunderhammer with a single trembling hand, the violet gravity core flaring to life with an unstable, sputtering light. "He wants the girl back," Cassian hissed, stepping behind Thrain's shield as the 6 Praetorians advanced, their metal boots clicking in perfect synchronization. "He wants to rebuild the loop. He'd rather rule a tomb of iron than let the sovereignty reclaim the sector." "He doesn't rule anything," Thrain grunted, his kinetic rifle clacking as he loaded his final high-velocity magazine. "He's just a broken engine that doesn't know how to turn off." Act 3. The Gambit executed. The final battle inside the hangar did not begin with a tactical command. It began with the ceiling giving way. A 20-foot section of the overhead logistics track collapsed, raining twisted iron and concrete down onto the hangar deck as a wave of 30 bleed drones poured into the room. The swarm didn't differentiate between the knights and the Directorate's machine men. They saw only a room filled with concentrated energy and organic tissue. "Clear the ramp," Cassian screamed. The 6 Praetorians moved instantly, their hive logic dictating that the swarm was the primary threat to their creator. They turned their tungsten blades outward, engaging the leaping bio-drones in a silent, horrific display of mechanical butchery, slicing through chitin and meat with mathematical efficiency. Valen used the distraction. He lunged forward, ignoring the combat to his left, his gunmetal boots shattering the deck plates as he closed the distance between his hammer and Vance's life support cradle. Vance saw him coming. "Inefficient!" the half-man shrieked. He triggered the shuttle's manual ventral defense turrets. Twin rotary lasers on the ship's underbelly swung downward, opening fire on Valen at point-blank range. High-frequency beams punched through Valen's left shoulder plate, melting the ancient brass weldings and severing the hydraulic lines to his arm. Valen didn't stop. He dropped his left arm entirely, letting it hang uselessly by his side, and transferred the Sunderhammer to his remaining right hand. With a final, desperate surge of his armor's backup power, he swung the hammer upward in a vertical gravity strike. The weapon hit the base of Vance's brass cradle with the force of a falling meteor. Audio cue. A massive, localized kinetic implosion that sounds like a thunderclap inside a closed iron vault. The sound transitions into the violent, high-pitched screech of electricity grounding out as Vance's life support cradle shatters into 1,000 pieces of sparking copper wire. Vance's remaining green eye went completely dark. The thick data tethers running into the shuttle's core snapped back, their copper cores weeping white-hot sparks. Instantly, the 6 Praetorians froze in mid-swing, their tungsten blades buried deep within the carcasses of the bleed drones they were fighting. They dropped to their knees, their emerald eyes dying out into the dark. Shuttle core logic. Override severed system. Status. Pilot manual control active. Valen, get aboard! Thrain bellowed, using his tower Aegis shield to hurl a dying drone off the loading ramp before sprinting up into the shuttle's interior hold. Cassian followed, carrying Lyra tight against his chest plate. Valen was the last to climb the ramp, his boots heavy, his damaged chassis trailing a line of gray oil and white smoke. As the automatic loading ramp slammed shut, sealing out the screams of the remaining swarm, Valen dropped heavily into the pilot's seat. His right hand locked onto the manual thruster yokes. He didn't need words. He slammed the throttles into maximum emergency burn. The assault shuttle's sublight engines erupted with a blinding blue flame that incinerated the remaining monsters inside the hangar, rocketing the ship out of the launch tube and into the black, unyielding void of space, leaving the burning cenotaph of Hive Keep, 9 to be swallowed by the dark. End of Book 1.